And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. And it's great to have a brand new guest all the way across the pond, and that is Sarah A. Carter. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a great show, and I'm so happy to be here.
Great. And I had the privilege of joining you on your show to discuss everything UK. It's great to have you discussing the excitement over there in the US, which provides excitement for us because we don't have much excitement in politics here in the UK. So thank you. People can follow you at Sarah Carter DC. And of course, on that, you've got the links to all your other platforms that you're on. People can find you on all of those. So make sure and jump on, click on that link just under the handle, and you'll get a list of everywhere that Sarah is on. But Sarah's a international award-winning investigative reporter. And I say this for a UK audience because she will be well known for the War and Posse for everyone stateside. But for the UK, I mean, her stories have ranged from national security, terrorism, immigration, and frontline coverage of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And she's been to some interesting countries, some that I may would not like to go to. So I'm glad she's done it and reported. And she is currently an investigative reporter and Fox News contributor. Um, Lots to get into. I know I've touched on some of your background. Maybe you'd like to just introduce yourself, especially to our UK audience, before we jump into all the fun things that are happening over there stateside.
Oh, I know. First of all, Peter, thank you so much for having me on your show. Your show is so incredible. It's a great show. And I'm glad we have this option, right? Where we can now speak not only freely, and we have X, of course, which is a monumental platform with Elon Musk, but we're able to talk to each other and communicate through podcasts. It becomes more of a global connection. And especially as individually, we're all fighting for our sovereignty, right? So I've been covering the board for all of you who don't know me out there. I've been a reporter, investigative reporter for more than 20 years. I actually started my career a little bit later than some, but in California, covering the cartels, the drug trafficking, gang affiliations in the beautiful state of California, which is a complete mess now because of the leadership there under Gavin Newsom. But for us, for me, I was born there, raised overseas, came back, and spent the rest of my youth in California. It was incredible to watch the deterioration of that state. A lot of that had to do with illegal immigration and the rise in gang affiliations and the failure of the government, the local government, to do its job in protecting its citizens. And it wasn't just about those that were on the outside of, the immigration issue, or, those that you would think of as being more wealthy Californians or people that were middle class. It was about the kids too. It was about our schools being overwhelmed, our public school systems, with children that were not being paid attention to, with school boards that were basically turning their backs on them and using taxpayer dollars to do their own thing instead of providing an education for the children. And we had, I mean, and we still do today, sadly, children killing each other in the schools, gangs, shootouts. I remember one time in my own neighborhood, there was a 15-year-old boy that had been laying dead in the front yard of his house for 2 days before they actually found him, because the grass was piled so high. And it's a nightmare. It was a nightmare scenario. And I thought, man, it can't get worse than this. And when I started covering the border, covering the gangs led me to the border. Covering the border led me to covering overseas. At basically setting a goal to be a Pentagon correspondent and covering the war zones, because I covered the border and I saw this narco traffic and terror, and what we considered a connection between narco terrorism and actual terrorism overseas, with the DEA, CIA, Western intelligence agencies that were monitoring what was happening in the United States and along our border and in Central America and Mexico. So I took off, came to Washington, D.C., to make a long story short, got hired by the Washington Times. They finally accepted that I was going to be a war correspondent. I don't think they were excited about that, having a woman going into the war zones at that time, but they agreed to it. I went to the Pentagon, signed off all of my paperwork, covered the Pentagon a little bit. And as soon as they started shipping people off to the battlefield, I was one of those first reporters in those groups that when I came in to head out there. Lara Logan was another reporter who was on the ground out there at the same time, female reporter. Um, Anthony Lloyd from Great Britain. I remember him being out there quite often. Kelly Kennedy, Chris Hondros, who was killed in Libya, and Tim Hetherington, and James Cantley, who has also disappeared and was taken prisoner by Islamic State. So I saw the world from many different points of view. And I thought to myself, even when I covered, the cartels, and I mean, I was going into Mexico, Peter. I was going into Nuevo Laredo when there were gun battles, and I was into Tijuana, when Ariano Felix was in charge of the Tijuana cartel there, and they were beheading people and leaving their heads along Highway 1, the police officials that they were usually involved in narcotics as well. So leaving signs, ratones or rats or traitors. They would do that. A very terroristic style type of killing, something we saw very familiar with the Middle East extremist radical groups there. So it was horrifying and mortifying for me to watch as I progressed through my career and covered President Trump in 2016, broke all the stories on the Russia hoax. So that was another big part of my work with John Solomon in the very beginning. But then to watch as the Biden administration came in and just drop all of the executive orders that had been put in place by President Trump, who was by far the only president under the time I had covered the border and the wars and everything else you can imagine under the sun as an investigative journalist. He was the only president that I'd covered that actually meant what he said. He said, I'm going to shut down that border. I'm going to do everything I can to do it. And he did. He fought Congress on it. He made executive orders. He had the Remain in Mexico. Stephen Miller was working with him on it. He really brought a semblance of control and sanity to the chaos that was happening globally with migration, which Great Britain has also faced such horrific problems with this. And then all of a sudden we have Biden. And it gets worse than anyone can imagine. The border, the floodgates.
Can I, before you jump into the Biden mess, can I just ask you, because whenever I was last over, people were saying, oh, you need to go to Eagle Pass. And everyone has talked about, you need to go to the border. And it's been the fashionable thing, rightly so, because of the chaos on the border in the last 4 years. But it's become the in thing, kind of go to the border. You were doing this long before it was fashionable. Why kind of focus on that? There must be much other areas that you could have focused on, which would have been probably less heads along the road type of thing.
It's a great question. And you're absolutely right. I was one of the only women, actually, over 20 years ago that was down at the border. Once in a while, I'd run into this Reuters journalist who I thought was really brilliant. He was very tall. He was British. And I used to joke around with him. I'd say, you just stick out like a sore thumb here in Mexico. I'd see him coming down a sidewalk. I wish I could remember his name, but he was a great reporter. There were hardly any of us because it was so dangerous. One of the most dangerous places to work in the world, and it still is considered one of the most dangerous when you're thinking of the cartels, was Mexico. And the reason why I chose that, and this is an important question, was because after September 11th, I believed there was a significant lapse in security at that border. That despite all the 9/11 Commission responses to what happened in September 11th, that there was an extraordinary failure in controlling what was happening at that border. Not only was I talking to sources in the U.S. intelligence apparatus or DEA or Western intelligence, as people would like to say, but also the local sheriffs and police. And I saw not only the extraordinary amount of narcotics and weapons that were moving back and forth just within our own communities, but I thought to myself, if they can get all of this in, if there can be this extraordinary organization, back then it was transnational criminal organizations, Sinaloa, Beltran Leyva, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, all of these massive criminal organizations that were running Mexico as a narco state, then what could come in? What could come in? A WMD, terrorists, other types of chemical or biological weapons. So my interest became very focused on that and also on our children. And I thought to myself, what kind of society are we when we are not even protecting ourselves? We're not even protecting our children. We're a nation of immigrants. I'm not taking that away. It's not about immigration. It's about national security and protecting the sovereignty of a nation. And that's what led me there. Over the last 4 years, it's been extraordinary. It became kind of like a hip thing to do. I think I was breaking ground, right? But all of a sudden, everybody wanted to be a border reporter. Let me tell you this. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for all the people that are down at the border telling stories. I'm grateful that there's a big response to it. But it's not just about what we're seeing on video coming across the river. I've seen that for over 20 years and I never saw it so bad as I've seen it now with 700, 1,000 plus coming across. But it's about the border being in every single one of our backyards, in our neighborhoods, right across America, because we have narcotics distribution centers across the United States that these cartels have set up. They have set up transit routes that are highly guarded, not just in Mexico and along the border, not just in Central America, Mexico and along the border, but throughout the United States, where they can move people from point A to point B without even the knowledge of our US law enforcement. It's very difficult to track these cartels. They've grown to enormous organizations with hundreds of billions of dollars, and our government's allowed us to have that. It almost became very cliche that everybody was just covering the border, right? The people crossing, because visually it's stunning, yes. But what is happening in the dark corners? What is happening in our streets, in our schools, in our neighborhoods? While we're just so hyper focused on the pictures, of what is happening at the border. And that's when I started to expand my work and I started looking at, this is not just about the border, it's also about Western civilization in general. We have enemies that want the destruction of our way of life. They do not want and not just enemies that live in the shadows that I've covered for so many years, like terrorist organizations like Islamic State or Al Qaeda or any of these other groups. But what about our adversaries, that look at the border as a way of weaponizing their targeting of our nation, of your nation, of the European countries? I mean, this is very serious. It's almost as if, we all fell asleep. And, we all know the story about the Trojan horse, but the Trojan horse was already inside our countries. I mean, it was like we delivered them into our nation, the weapons, and I think that's why the American people all of a sudden started waking up. They were like, wait a minute, it is in my backyard. Wait a minute, this is happening in our schools. Why did we lose 140,000 plus people to fentanyl poisoning the way that we lost it? And let me tell you, a lot of the people, and I don't know how it is in England right now in Great Britain, but in the United States, we had massive waves, and we still do, of fentanyl tablets coming into the country. And those precursor chemicals came from China. Those precursor chemicals were basically handed over to the cartels. The cartels use them to make these pills. And also they've spiked cocaine, they've put it in marijuana. So kids are going out and partying and they're dropping like that. They're dying. No child or no college student. And I say child because just several months ago, a gentleman in the Rio Grande Valley, lost his 15-year-old daughter and her 15-year-old friend. And this happens every day. This story just sticks out in my head. He found him dead in their bedroom because they had taken what they thought was an Adderall, and they died. It was pure fentanyl. And so
the drugs issues, looking at that from a European position or British position, and right. I had no grasp of it, no concept, because what the US is facing is on a level 100 times to what Europeans are facing in terms of. I remember it was April and June 2022. I went to LA. The first time I ever been to California. I think probably the last time I'll go to California. And sadly, I never got to enjoy what it was like under Reagan before it was destroyed by the Democrats. But it was the only. I remember I did 9 cities in 14 days, I think, in middle of 2022, and LA was the only one I felt completely unsafe in, with people just wandering around, lying on the pavements, lying on the roads, and it was like a war zone. And I came away quite pissed off at how is this allowed to happen? Is no one angry? And it's come to this stage, maybe in parts of the US, where it's just accepted that's just the norm. But it to me, as a Brit, it was utterly shocking seeing that, and I've never seen anything like it. And even the tent cities and on, and I've never seen anything like it up to then, and I've never seen anything like it from then, and it really blew my mind.
It is. It's absolutely mortifying that we don't we don't do anything to stop that. That we've allowed this to happen. And I think the American people were kind of asleep as well, just thinking that this is a normal part. It like crept up on them. It was like mission creep, right? Like people didn't realize it until they woke up one morning and then a man's defecating in their front lawn in Georgetown. Or like I saw with my daughter one time, we were driving, and it was Georgetown again. And this is a beautiful neighborhood. That's why I bring it up in Washington, D.C. area. And my daughter says, Mommy, why is that man taking a bath in someone's front yard? And he was completely nude. He was scrubbing himself down in the front yard. There were tents everywhere. I was in Pennsylvania in Kensington, where there's an overwhelming problem with fentanyl and heroin, and the for miles and miles, blocks and blocks and blocks, you see people on fentanyl, mixtures of fentanyl that I can't even begin to understand how the human body can survive it. Some of this is used as tranquilizers or tranks used on elephants and things like this, and they dilute them so that they can get even a bigger high. And you see people like zombies walking across the street. I've covered that story over and over again. And I will tell people I have traveled all through Central America. I have been to San Salvador. I've been to Guatemala. I've been everywhere in Mexico. I've never seen this in any other country. And I say to myself, this is it. This is the Trojan horse, right? We don't need armies and tanks and to really be at war. We need an enemy that floods our nation and a people willing to do it, willing to take it. But we need an enemy willing to flood our nation with poison. And not only have we flooded our nation with poison, but we have a government, an established government that did nothing to stop it. National security failure at epic proportions, did not care. And the question that I have, because at least if there was a policy in place, at least if there was some kind of policy, but it failed, I would say, okay, they were terrible at policy. They had a bad policy, but they rethought it and they tried to change it. There was no policy. The policy, there was no policy to stop it. The policy was to leave the border wide open. And that has to be the question has to be why. Why would someone's own government purposefully attempt to destroy their nation? And I think in Great Britain, I wish I can remember, and maybe you can clarify this for me, but there was an incredible speech that was all over X recently where somebody said, this is purposeful. This was a move by globalists to destroy our nations and to really imprison our own people. And I tell this to people all the time. This is not freedom. What has happened here is an absolute way of controlling the populace. That is what these globalists want. They want to control the populace. And I think, what we've seen with the election with President Trump is a big wake up call where people are like, wait a minute, I'm watching what's happening. I don't want this to happen to my child. I don't want this to happen to my country. I refuse to allow this to happen. And now they have become the cavalry, right? That have worked to put other elected officials like President Trump back in office and others with the hope that we can stop this momentum in this horrible direction that we're heading in, because we're really heading for the destruction of the Western world as we know it. And
And
that's
what I want to get on to where we're heading. I know you interviewed Tom Homan recently, but there was another interview you did very recently, which was Jaco Boyens, and that's another part of an open border on the sex trade and people trafficking.
right.
But for you as a journalist looking at this and highlighting this, and yet there is silence, more or less silence amongst the media. Maybe some media begun to wake up, but actually it was the left or the mainstream media attacking parts of the media for highlighting this abject failure of how to run a country, for society, of government. And it was a weird situation. How did you see that as a journalist, whenever you see journalists attacking other journalists for simply highlighting what the truth is and the failures of society?
It's unbelievable to me because I remember, now I'm more of a commentator. I am a journalist still. I do investigative columns. I try to get out there and do my podcasts are based on talking to people that are experts in the field and bringing them in and revealing stories that maybe others had not heard of. But I was stunned and mortified. I remember when I first started working as a journalist, I was so excited to be breaking so many stories, incredible stories. And I thought, oh, wow, now the Washington Post is going to jump on this, or the New York Times, and I'm never going to get to keep my story because I would be working for a newspaper that maybe had less resources. They would have all the resources. We always kind of looked up to them. And then I realized, no, they're not doing that.
Yeah.
They're not exposing those stories. I remember when I wrote the first stories that exposed the link, the nexus between the drug cartels and terrorist organizations, and how our US apparatus was really hyper concerned with good reason that drug cartels would allow these terrorist organizations to utilize transit routes into the United States, or adversarial nation states would utilize those same routes to get into the United States without detection. And I was called an alarmist. Oh, you're just an alarmist. That will never happen. Why wouldn't it happen? Why wouldn't it? We have people all the time. So to see journalists turn their back on the least of us, our job as journalists is to be a voice for the voiceless. It's to speak up and to call out, to be a watchdog on the governments, to hold them accountable for what they are doing with the populace, right? So it's our job to do that, not to work hand in hand. I remember during the Russia hoax, this was the very last big stories that I did for a news organization and with Fox News, as well as with Sinclair News Group. And we broke the stories on Russia hoax, on what was going on with President Trump, how the Obama administration had expanded its spying, what was going on with Carter Page, what happened at Trump Tower, all those stories. And I thought to myself, wow, I really did. This is it. This is the Pulitzer story. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, all of them are going to jump on this, and they're just going to go crazy with it. Instead, they lapped up the soup or whatever was being served to them, or the liquor that John Brennan, the head of the CIA, James Comey, the head of the FBI, James Clapper, who was then head of director of national intelligence, gave them, just handed them on a silver platter without question. and they targeted a sitting US president of these United States that had been duly elected and voted into office. And they turned the whole world, or they attempted to turn the whole world against him. They called him a stooge for Russia. And instead of doing their job and, doing the right thing and actually exposing the corruption in the government, they became a tool of the government. And they did the same with, look, Jaco Boyens is amazing. Tara Rodas is amazing. I want to highlight that in the United States, a nation that is founded upon principles in the Constitution that should never allow slavery or servitude in this nation, that should speak out against the maltreatment of children and the sexual exploitation of people and the raping of children, that we should be the first in line to call that out, and that every news agency should back that up. And it has taken, some of them haven't even talked about it at all. Others targeted movies like Sound of Freedom, saying, oh, that's an over exaggeration. Finally, there was a reporter at the New York Times, and I wish I could remember her name off the top of my head, who did an incredible piece on slavery in the United States, utilizing children. I mean, big corporations, I won't name them here because we don't want to do that right now, but they can read the story in the New York Times. But that, that sell cereal, that sell chicken, that had their factories were filled with underage children in every single state that have been trafficked across our border by the Biden administration. These kids were working in these factories in indentured servitude. That's unacceptable to me. It is absolutely stunning. It is unacceptable. And I'm so grateful for Jaco Boyens, and I'm so grateful for Tara Rodas, who was the whistleblower at HHS, and others who blew the whistle and have come forward, because I've been reporting for more than 20 years how these children have been exploited at the border, how kids have been raped, how kids have been brought into this country and lost forever. And, frankly, very few people talked about that publicly. And I don't know if Peter, I don't know if it's because it's too difficult to face that reality. I don't know if it's hard for people to accept that reality, because once you accept that, you can't just walk away from it. Once you know that children as little as 2 years old are being raped and abused and lost in the system, you can't just walk away from it anymore. It's a very difficult pill to swallow. We don't want to believe that that exists. So I don't know but I think it is a journalistic failure. I think it is a failure. Our job is to be, again, the voice for the voiceless. Our job is to expose the truth, no matter how difficult that is. Even when you like someone, even when you think they've been the best source ever. Let's say John Brennan was the best guy ever for some of these folks at the New York Times and the Post. When he came up to them and delivered those lies, it didn't matter whether it was John Brennan or if it was Michael Hayden, who was his buddy but was a Republican. It didn't matter who it was. They should have said, wait a minute, show me proof. Give me 3 sources. And then I need to find those sources to make sure that that is the truth. But you don't just take the word of the head of an agency that is known to lie to then spread their lies as part of their propaganda machine. That was not our job.
It's when you look at the US, and there is still a US identity. The American dream is still there. It's been chopped at and abused, and there have been attempts to destroy that. But there is still a pull for America. Very different in Europe. The Europe are struggling massively with what it means for identity, as the EU have tried to erase the nation state and what it means for nation sovereignty. So Europe are in a huge struggle, but America still has an understanding of what American means. So it's weird how you look at mass immigration, the impacts on, especially on the sector of the drugs trade. America kind of should be thinking, and I'm just trying to work this out, that actually that's not how we do things. We know what our identity is. You'd expect the destruction is happening in America, more to happen in Europe than it has, but on a lesser level. And yet it's Europeans who are struggling with what it means and identity. And even in Europe, I think yesterday there was a headline on in Belgium that sex workers have now got maternity and pension benefits in a world first. And the Europe sees it as like a little cottage industry, something that you choose, something that a girl grows up and that's what she would like to be. Um, um, so I'm wondering how that kind of identities, how that produces the chaos that we have. Because I see the US and it shouldn't be in the situation because Americans have that strong identity. You've got flag, you've got culture, you've got history. Where Europe, that's been wiped out.
I know you brought up so many good points. How do I pull this thread?
I
It's
just
a
thought
lot
I'd
of
throw it all
threads.
at you.
I'm like, great, it's a lot of threads, but I can do this. Because while you were talking, I think what's happened with America, first, I'll start there, is that we've had a lot of infiltration in our university systems. Now, we do, you're right. We still do have this very nationalistic, I think a good 50% of us, identity, of we are Americans, we stand for this, this is our history, we are a nation of immigrants, right? And I want to think and think about it this way. We are a nation of immigrants, and I would say legal immigration, but like my mother who came from Cuba in the 1960s on the Johnson Freedom flights was so proud to be an American, right? That when people would ask her, they would say, "Oh, you're Cuban?" She would say, "No, I'm American." She would be just like, "Wait a minute, I'm so offended." That you would call. I left Cuba because I had to. I had to flee in the end, but I have nothing to do with that nation. I'm an American. And because of that, and because we have these kind of renegades, I call it the X gene renegades, people who have left everything behind, whether they're from Vietnam, Cuba, Ireland, Great Britain, whether they came hundreds of years ago or just yesterday, Australia, wherever they came from in the world, they came with a decision that they made that I am going to start a new life and a new chapter for future generations of my family. So, kind of the renegades, right? Now, you have the renegades and you have those that are like ready to be American. And then you have those that have infiltrated the system and want to see that system changed. I call them the Obamas. And they're not Obama light. They're Obama heavy, right? They believe that America is not a beacon of light shining on a hill. They see America as a problem. They see America as a colonizer, something that is brutal and bad in some ways and needs to be restructured. They see the Constitution as antiquated, that it needs to be revamped and or removed in some way altogether. And you have this clash, kind of like the clash of the titans in America, right? And you have these professors that have been indoctrinating so many people for decades now. I would say even pre Hillary college days, right? I mean, she was already indoctrinated there into the Saul Alinsky, school of radicals, right? And we saw all of this, and they figured out how to kind of manipulate it and use it for their own benefit because they're also very selfish, just like any good communist or socialist. They want to have all the money and put all the money in their pockets and then have all the minions live the way, in poverty and do all the hard work. So you have that clash. But there was kind of an awakening in America, a big awakening, not just a little awakening. We saw it with Charlie Kirk, right? With Turning Point USA, where I think it was very brilliant. It was probably one of the most significant. I know Charlie, and I don't think I've ever told him this, but personally, but his movement started to shine light on what was happening throughout our universities and our school systems. It didn't allow the disease to fester, right? It's still there, but it's exposed. So we know it exists. In Europe, tragically, I don't know, and I don't want to debate European politics that much, but and I want to talk a little bit about that thread when it comes to, Belgium and, how we look at, the service of women, in prostitution or whatever, and the legalization of that. I had, and because I deal with children so much that have been abused, a lot of children that are trafficked are abused children already. So I want people to understand this. The majority of women that are in that service industry, supposedly in the line of prostitution and that work in these industries, are come from abuse. They are women that have been usually abused since they were very young. This Their sexuality is has been kind of ripped apart, like their spirit. They don't really, and I know this from talking to them. They don't really know how to see themselves. And even if you sell yourself after the age of 18, if you've been abused since the age of 2, 5, 6, or 7, um, what you're purchasing, sadly, is somebody who is spirit has been broken, who has been abused, who's damaged goods, who has never had anyone treat her the way she needs to be treated. Even if she thinks or he thinks that this is the future. Wow, I'm making money. I'm making my own choices. No, you're really not. You're really selling yourself out and your whole, your respect and your body. Now, we can debate that all day long on how Europeans see that, side of things. I'm talking from personal experience and meeting children that have actually been tragically abused, horrifically abused, and they have to go to therapy. And it takes a lot to recover to some sense of normalcy for these children. And some of them do recover, and some of them don't. Some of them have committed suicide. Some of them go into the sex trade because that's just the only thing they're comfortable with. It's the only thing they know. But losing your identity in Europe it is quite tragic, because, and I don't know if it had to do with the EU and this idea of we're just gonna, we're all one, instead of celebrating and cherishing each other's cultural differences and the beauty in that, and protecting the nation's boundaries and borders. I mean, look at what's happening now in Amsterdam. Look at what's happening in Great Britain, in London. I mean, you've talked about this so much, Peter, but you see a transformation of your nation, a transformation where, sadly, there are some situations where the cultural, I mean, it's a collision course, because Western society cannot live side by side with not some non-Western societies that do not believe women, I mean, have the exact same equal rights as men, where little girls can go to school and just, play sports and, make their own decisions of who they want to date and where they want to go. I mean, that's part of who we are. We have the right to choose, and we have the right. I have lived in the Middle East. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I mean, my father worked for Lockheed Martin, from the time I was about 6 years old until I was 12, 13 years old, when my father got really sick. We had to come back to the United States, but I was in Saudi Arabia. I remember going through the souk and shopping at the marketplace with my mom, and understanding that I could not step outside those bounds, and neither could my mother. She couldn't drive a car then. She had to go on the bus. We had to be completely covered. My mother, especially, when I was a little girl, not so much. I had to be covered, but not so much. But my mother, yes. And you had to live by those rules. Now, Saudi Arabia is transforming, it's changing a little bit. Um, but we saw with the extremism, both in the Middle East, and what happened during the last 20 years plus, America's longest war in Afghanistan, and the terror attacks that we face not only here in the United States, but come on, it's like we have amnesia. We had the Madrid train bombings, Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan, what happened in Great Britain. I mean, my gosh, stabbings on the streets, a society of people. And look, I'm not saying we shouldn't have immigration from everywhere in the world, but legally, people should be vetted. It should be proper. That's what Tom Homan and I were talking about. Should be proper vetting of people coming into your country. Do you want to have someone living next door to you that looks at your child or your daughter, who's a criminal, or somebody who has never thought of a woman as anything other than just a piece of property that they could do whatever they want with. I don't think so.
I wanna I wanna end. I'd love to do a whole show with you on Saudi Arabia and that clash, but we'll not even get into that because that would sidetrack us far too much. But it's this look in the future, and I mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned again having Tom Homan on, and he one of many revolutionary picks, and I think it is going to be the most revolutionary administration that really any of us have ever seen in terms of what has to be done to fix the problems. But me touch on that going forward because America is in a crisis at the moment in terms of many areas, and it seems as though President Trump is willing. I'm sure they'll not all be perfect, but is willing to put the people in place to get a grip off the issues that America faces and fix them. So, I mean, tell us your thoughts as an American when you see some of those names go forward, and how you see that fixing the hole that America is currently in.
I mean, I'm excited. I think this is for the first time, I feel that President Trump, he not only understands how this political game, he's been through hell for the last, right? I mean, they have targeted this man. He doesn't have to be doing this. Everyone says that. And they're right. He doesn't have to be doing this. He could be just golfing in Scotland and enjoying his time with Melania and his family without all the pain and suffering that he has had to go through. And he endured that for all of us. And by the way, two assassination attempts, one that almost did take his life in Butler, Pennsylvania. But I think about Tom Homan, and I know him personally, and I work with him at Border 911 Foundation. He loves this country, and he loves the people that he is trying to help. By shutting down that border, he is actually going to save lives. He is not going to allow this perpetual industry of illicit human trafficking and drug trafficking to continue. And he is going to deport first incarcerated criminals, get them all out of here, send them back home. And because President Trump is in office, he is going to be able to conduct those negotiations. I think he is the greatest negotiator on planet Earth. I really do. I think he is brilliant. Look, Trudeau was
I
eating
saw that.
in Mar-a-Lago. I mean, you can't beat that. I mean, and not only eating with a smile on his face and saying, you know what? We're going to work out a deal before you put those tariffs on us. We're going to figure this out. And Mexico is starting to do its job because they want leadership. Look, neither the president of Mexico, she doesn't want it, neither Trudeau wants it. Nobody wants the mess that we have seen for the last 4 years, because even Mexico has had to pay a price for it. Even if they've opened the border and have allowed, because it was so overwhelming, allowed people in. Remember, there's a lot of people that just stay behind. And these cartels are amassing so much money that the government of Mexico has to contend with that. They have to contend with a narco state. So they don't want this. So they are probably just like, thank you, God, for bringing President Trump back, because he can carry the big stick, right? And he can say, you better do this or we're going to do that. And they're like, oh, okay, well, see, we have to do this. So now we're going to shut this down. It kind of gives them all permission to do the right thing. Now, Tom Homan, he's also promised, and this is something he and I have discussed, at nauseum and at length, that the first, on top of removing criminals off the streets, incarcerated criminals, that at the same time, our focus is going to be finding those children. Remember, we had over 500,000 unaccompanied minors that have come into the United States under the Biden administration. Over 300,000 of those children we do not have records for. We cannot find them. We don't know where they're at. Now, granted, some of them may be with guardians that are taking good care of them, but we think a good portion of them have been taken into other industries. Some of these kids have been lost on the streets. Some of them have been forced into the sex trade. We know that some of them were taken to a strip club, Peter. That's crazy. They were actually released from our custody and taken to a strip club. That was the address that was given to HHS, to Health and Human Services. So with people like Tara Rodas, with Jaco Boyens, Kash Patel as head of the FBI upon confirmation, and others, I think we're going to see a cleanup like we've never seen before. And he's going to put people in that are going to gut these systems, like the FBI, which, by the way, has been an utter and complete failure and embarrassment, going after God only knows. I want to ask Kash Patel. In fact, I may FOIA my name to see how many times John Solomon and I had been like actually been spied on. So we could look at that from the past. But I think the important thing is that the American people are like, yes, this is Reformation time. We are going to change what needs to be changed. We're going to get back to the basics, and we're going to own our country again. Because in the United States of America, and I want to remind everybody of this, it's the American people, each individual American citizen, that is the boss of this government. They are not the boss of us. And President Trump understands that. And that's why when he gets out there, and when Tom Homan gets out there and speaks to the American people, they keep their promises. That's why when he says things publicly, he actually does them, because the American people are in charge. They're paying the bill. They pay. Our taxpayer dollars pay for this government. And, and I think even across the pond, people have to start thinking that way. We all have to start realizing that in our democracies or in our republics like the United States, that we are the voice of reason, that we are the people that matter, and that when they don't do the job that is required of them to run our nations and take care of our families and our national security, that we have the right to fire them. And when they have to do something, they need to explain it to us, and it needs to go through a process. They can't just do it to us. They are not the kings and queens in charge. Excuse me. I know you got kings and queens, but you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. It's symbolic there, but they are not that way. We are in charge of our destiny. It is us. And I think when we come to realize that, we get our countries back, right? Europe needs to get that back. The European people need to stand up and say, no more. Not another child of mine is going to be attacked on the streets of Amsterdam. No more. Not another day goes by where we're going to put up with what this government is trying to enforce on us, because we have the right, and the right lies with us. And when we give up those rights, we have bureaucracies that become emboldened, overpowered, full of power, and they believe that they can do anything. And that's why we've got to take that back now. We got to knock them down a few notches and let them know that they are not the end all be all, and that they don't own us.
No,
That they work for us.
It's exciting, because I know that President Trump is going to embolden a lot of what's happening in Europe. The Freedom Party came top in a local poll a couple of days ago. Alternative for Deutschland polling at about 20%. And what's happening in America is going to spread and give momentum to the rise of populist parties all across Europe. So it's certainly not just constrained to America, but what is happening with you is going to spread very much wider. Sara, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for giving us your thoughts. You've done so much work on the border, as I said before, it became fashionable. You were there in those extremely dangerous situations and many other places in the world war zone. So appreciate you coming on and giving us your expert analysis of what is happening over in your country.
It's my pleasure, Peter. Thank you so much. And it's okay to be popular. Don't feel bad. Don't feel bad. Take back the power, right? And take back your countries. There's no greater feeling in the world than what we felt on election day when those numbers rolled in and we saw that President Trump actually became the president of these United States again, and that we were going to get back to where we needed to be. I can't tell you the celebrations here, how people felt and how great it was. So we're hoping the same for Europe, for Great Britain, which I mean, we look to you when we as well. For your leadership and friendship. And God bless you, Peter, and your beautiful nation. I can't wait to go to London. I want fish and chips and just a great time. And I want to go to a pub. What was your favorite pub again?
I have lots of favorite pubs. So you can't narrow that down. That's an impossible question. But
I
do come. But before London becomes fully Londonistan, do come and enjoy whatever English parts are left of London. Or we'll go outside London. We'll go to Windsor and see the castle and the royal family and all that stuff.
That's what I'd like. That's what I like. Not Londonistan, but I'd like that. And okay, I remembered one pub. I walked by it. I never forgot its name, the Handsome Cab. I don't know what it is. So don't no nobody from England come after me on that one. If it's a bad pub, I don't know. But I remember thinking I want to go to that pub one day. But anyways, I love Great Britain. I can't wait to come see you. And yes, let's go outside of London. I still haven't seen Stonehenge, so maybe one of these trips I'll get to see it.
Be into it. An hour outside London, it's easy. And go to Windsor and Winchester anyway. We'll do a whole travel show. So again, thanks for your time. I know you've got a lot happening there, not only in your world on the journalistic side, but in the political realm, and it is non-stop. So thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.